When you look at your life, what do you see? Accomplishments? Victories? Fulfillment? Mistakes? Failures? Missed opportunities? Everything that was? Everything that could be? Or do you see something more? Something guiding you through the highs and lows towards something better?
Take a deep breath. Now take a deep breath and hold it for as long as you can. What goes through your mind? Do your thoughts slow down or do they speed up? Raise your hand if some part of you panics. Oh, I am not the only one, am I? Okay, some part of us panics. Free divers dive underwater on a single breath hold. Rather than rely on a breathing device like scuba gear, they simply hold their breath and dive. Most of us likely have done that at one time or another, right? Either as little kids, chasing toy rings around the bottom of a swimming pool, in my case, pretending to be the Little Mermaid. We know what that feels like. But competitive freedivers take it to a whole other level. Most of us understand that there are physiological effects to holding our breath, right? Our oxygen levels decrease, and carbon dioxide accumulates in the body, and if you let that go on for too long, it will ultimately affect your functions. We understand that. But what fascinates me is that in some ways, the human body is built for doing that underwater. See, there are a whole nother set of physiological effects that happen when you go underwater. When you put your body and expose it to pressure at depth. All of us, every single one of us, if we were to hold our breath right now and dive in a swimming pool, we would have a reflex kick in. It's called the diving reflex. It's the same instinct that every marine mammal has, like whales and dolphins and seals. Your body will actually, with that impulse, it will slow your heart rate to nearly half, and it will pull the blood away from your extremities to concentrate it to feed and protect your most vital organs, like your lungs and your brain and your heart. And if you're a competitive free diver and you take your body into the deep, I'm talking 165 feet or deeper, a second physiological reflex kicks in. It's called the blood shift. See, what happens is the pressure on the body causes the lungs to compress. And they compress to a point where they reach residual volume beyond which they're not supposed to get any smaller. And so what happens is the capillaries in your lungs engorge with blood to harden your lungs so that they don't collapse. But even with these built-in survival adaptations, even with a body capable of going into the deep, at the end of the day, we're human. We need and want to breathe. And it's that tension. It's that tension of both wanting to dive and wanting to surface that the French freediving champion Guillaume Néry talks about. He describes it as, on one hand, flying. At a certain point, he says, when he gets past 115 feet, he no longer needs to swim because the density of his body, the heaviness of his body, is actually dropping like a rock. The ocean is pulling him down. And he describes that sensation as flying through the blue. But on the other hand, the farther down he goes, the greater the pressure. And with that pressure on his body, his diaphragm collapses. His rib cage squeezes in. And he likens that sensation to suffocating. It is a suffocating flight. Now, last week, we started a 3-week sermon series. And it's about perspective. And we learned that God delivered his people Israel up out of bondage in Egypt, but he didn't immediately deliver them to the promised land. Instead, he took them on a long road through the wilderness. And he used that time under tension to build them up, to build their courage and their character and their faith. Last week, we explored ways to find hope when the journey simply takes too long. But I bet most of you would agree with me, right? That we don't mind a long journey if it's fun. We don't mind taking the scenic route if we're having a good time. And so the problem really wasn't that it took too long. The problem was that it was hard. They were really, really uncomfortable. I don't know about you, but I like to be comfortable. So how do we do it? How do we do it? How do we go on a really, really hard journey? How do we do tough things and manage? When we don't pick the path that we're on, when this isn't what we would want to be doing? What lessons can we learn today, right now, about doing hard stuff, being in a hard place, from the Israelites in the wilderness, or from what our French freediver Guillaume calls the journey between two breaths? It's this that I want to explore today, but let's pray first. Father, I know that you are here in this place. Like Travis said, you are always here. You are always running me down. You were here before I showed up, and you were here before they showed up. But Father, would you give us eyes to see? Would you give us eyes to see you, to hear you today? I ask that for myself and for my family and for every person here. In Jesus' name, amen. Israel's life in Egypt had been nothing short of a living nightmare. I went back through and I found every verse where it talks about what that was like. It said that Israel was enslaved by taskmasters. It says their lives were bitter with hard labor. It says that they groaned, they cried out in groaning, and they sighed because of their cruel bondage. The Bible uses really descriptive words like suffering and oppression and affliction and burden. It says they were regularly beaten. It says that they grew despondent, which means they lost hope and they lost courage. It was so bad that when Moses looks back at it, he calls Egypt an iron furnace. And so God heard them and God delivered them and he started them on that really long road of recovery. And it wasn't easy and it wasn't quick. And so the Bible tells us that only about a month and a half in, remember from last week, it's a 40-year journey they end up on, and only a month and a half in, they start to question whether it wouldn't have been preferable to die in Egypt's iron furnace than to be where they currently were. It says in Exodus, this is Israel talking, "Would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill us with hunger." Note that there are really only two options there: die in Egypt or die here. They have completely given up on and stopped considering where they're headed. They're no longer picturing what they have to live for, where God's taking them, because the hardship of right now makes them lose sight and look back over their shoulder to where they'd been. Even though it meant their enslavement, even though it was miserable, they longingly look back, not just once, but over and over again. In Numbers, they say this: "We remember the fish we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic, but now our appetite is gone. There is nothing at all to look at except this manna." This is not true hunger. Hunger is a need not being met. That's not what this is. God met his people's need. He satisfied their hunger with manna. Manna was a bread that showed up every morning from heaven. It manifested with the dew. And they would gather it up and they would make it into cakes, wafer cakes, that tasted like honey and oil. This isn't hunger. This is craving. This is a want not being satisfied. Apostle Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, described it this way. He said, "I don't want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers," meaning Israel, "they were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. And they were all baptized with Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and they all ate the same spiritual food, and they all drank the same spiritual drink. It was Christ, but nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, and they were laid low in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved." In the Greek, it's that we would not become cravers as they craved. That Greek word there means to desire, to covet, to lust after, to long for. What's so wrong with that? Am I the only one? What's so wrong with that? Anybody with taste buds would not want to celebrate their 100th plus day of wafers, right? What's wrong with it? But here's the thing. In this case, Israel's craving, their pleasure seeking, was in the opposite direction of where God was trying to take them. Now, please, I don't want you to misunderstand me, okay? Craving is not inherently wrong. Neither is pleasure. Neither are all the flavors. Neither is nostalgia, looking back on the past to reminisce. But that's not what this is. So when we find ourselves in a struggle, when we find ourselves in that hard place, we need to ask ourselves, is this moving me toward my goal or away from it? We have to keep the goal in mind. I find exercise really, really not fun. I'm not one of those people that's like, oh, that sounds good. I don't like it most of the time. But for example, if I'm weight training, that is a kind of hard, that is a kind of difficult, that I need to lean into rather than away from, because that is taking me toward who I want to be, toward results that I'm looking for, toward the life that God's called for me. It does me no good in that moment to crave a milkshake, right? Or a nap. That's not helpful. That's destructive. About free diving, our champion freediver, Guillaume, said this: at depth, you can very easily lose your ground and start to panic. When that happens, you think, where's the surface? I want to go up. I want to breathe now. You should not do that. Never look up to the surface, not with your eyes or your mind. You should never picture yourself up there. Again, he's a human. I understand that he does, in fact, at some point need to surface. Don't misunderstand me. The subtle truth that I am reaching for, the little nugget that I think is here, is that there is a place, and it's different for each one of us, but it is a reality that when life gets hard, we have an impulse to get distracted. When stuff gets hard, we want to cast our eyes to what is easy and fun and elsewhere. Is your craving, is the thing your heart is set on, what you're dwelling on, what you're thinking about, is that taking you forward towards your goal? Is it taking you to freedom, or is it taking you to enslavement? But Israel, they took it a step further, though. It wasn't just that they looked longingly at what Egypt offered them, it's that they seemed to forget the bad. They seemed to forget how bad that was. They let selective memory rob them of the truth. They were so wanting to dwell on what it gave them that they disregarded what it took. Their lives, their freedom, their inheritance. It sounds like something we would never do. I would never do that. How did they do that? And yet, gosh, this week I thought of so many ways I do that. Every time we cling to a destructive habit that we know is killing us, but it brings us comfort somehow. Every time we make our joy contingent on if I just get there, or if I just have that, or if we just do this, then every time we set our heart, we determine that our best days were behind us, when God is always, always doing something new. We do this. If we're going to face hard things, we're going to have to keep the good in mind. Not the good of the past, not the good of what's over the fence, but the good of right here and right now. Israel's craving, setting their eyes everywhere except where God had them, kept them so dissatisfied. In Numbers, they said, "Why have you made us come up from Egypt to bring us to this wretched place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink, and we loathe this miserable food." Lots of food complaints. Yeah, they were so focused on missing what they didn't have that they missed what they did. They were so determined to be dissatisfied that they soured the current experience. They didn't appreciate the manna, or that God was presenting himself to them every day and every night. They didn't revel in the fact that they were the eyewitnesses to some of the greatest movements of God on the earth. Miracles and manifestations that generations to come were going to crave and long for and pine after through the judges and through the kings and through the prophets. They were the ones, they were the recipients, and they missed it. Grumbling makes us miss the glory of God in our midst. It takes away from us this moment. And I know this is hard. The honest truth is, this sermon was for me. Y'all just all came to hear it. This is what I'm in the middle of. This is what God's doing in me. And my brother, Trey, he asked me, "How do you feel about the sermon series?" And I don't want to keep being a broken record, but this is what I'm doing now. And so, at the risk of being repetitive, this is hard for me. This is panic-inducing hard. But what I told him is, there's pressure. There's a lot of pressure. But I just don't want to panic to the point that I miss the joy. Because you know what? Yeah, I wish there was an easier way, but I love this. I love talking about God. He's what I want to be doing. This is what I want to be doing. This is what I'm passionate about. And I don't want to miss the joy of this right now, looking at your faces this moment, to panic. And my brother, who free dives when he spearfishes, said, "Oh yeah, I get that. It's like free diving." I said, "Explain that to me." And he said, "Well, you've got to relax to dive. If you're going to be a good fisherman, you've got to relax. But when you're holding your breath, every part of your body and brain is slamming on the panic button. Your mind is racing. And so the way that I've found through that is to just lean in and be fully present to the moment. And so I find a fish. I find a teeny little white or yellow fish set against that big blue. And I just look at it. I just study it, its color, its detail, the little breaths it's breathing in and out. It's beautiful. And so there I am at 80 feet, staring at the small stuff. Because to panic is death. And so where I am is right here. Our French freediver, Guillaume, he put it this way: you have to stay in the present. Not the surface, the present. I look at the rope right in front of me, leading me back to the surface, and I focus on that, on the present moment. We have to keep the good in mind, the good of being right here, right now. We have to. And I don't know how it strikes you. To me, it sounds really counterintuitive that the harder something gets, the more I want to hit the panic button, the more peace I find by leaning into it rather than away, by giving it my full attention. But you know what? I think that's what God does. Our passage, remember, is in Deuteronomy. And it says this: has any God ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation? Hard stuff. By testings, by signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, by great and awesome deeds, like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes. You were shown these things so that you might know that he is God. Besides him, there is no other. From heaven on, he made you hear his voice to discipline you. And on earth, he showed you his great fire because he loved your ancestors and chose their descendants after them. He brought you out of Egypt by his presence. God did hard things by his presence. See, he showed up to the moment. He was in it, right there with them. So how do we do that? How do we do that? How do we do what he did and show up and lean in? And I think the answer is in that verse: because he loved your ancestors and chose their descendants. Because he loved. Love is the why that bears up under the how. God knew his why. He loved. They were enough for him right where they were as they were. And nothing diminished that. Their grumbling and their complaining and their looking back to where they'd been only soured their experience. It didn't sour him. He loved them. When we really love somebody, they're what we crave. They're what we think about. They're what we long for, and they are enough. Have any of you ever been just madly in love? Do you remember that feeling? They were all you needed. I remember listening to emo music, like driving home from law school, just being like, I just need to get back to Derek. Because he was it. He was it. And it didn't matter whether we were going somewhere really uncomfortable or unfun. It was in sickness or in health, for richer or poorer. Because you're it, and where you are, I want to be. When I was a little girl, I remember asking my mom, how is it? How is it that you knew that my dad was the one? And she said, this was how she described it to me. She was like, you know that feeling when you've been like working for too long and you just get completely disconnected from the world? Like you don't have the TV on and you haven't checked the news and you haven't listened to the radio and you haven't looked at a clock. And so all of a sudden you look up and you just sort of like, whew, I need to figure out what's going on in the world. You know that feeling? She said, being with your father was like having the radio turned on. You know, I just knew we were good. One of my all-time favorite verses is something God told his people after they had turned away, and it's heartbreaking. He says, I remember the devotion of your youth. I remember how as a bride you followed me through a wilderness, through a land not sown. I remember when I was enough. Because what God says is, you're enough for me. Can it not be about where we're headed? Can it just be about this? Oh God, give us the grace and the strength to live like that. To not condition our devotion, but to give him our fealty because he is enough. I don't want to miss it. I don't want him to be taking me in this direction, saying, come over here, if you'll just let me show you this thing. I really want you to see this thing. And for me to be looking over my shoulder, it's somewhere I've already been. I want to be with him. I want to be with you in this moment, soaking up that God is here. Wilderness roads are long and they're hard. Life is hard, and it is so easy for us to lose our way, to lose the moment, to get distracted, to lose that rope that's taking us home again. But if we can keep the goal in mind, if we can keep the good in mind, not of what's been, but right now, right here, if we can lean in, I am fully convinced that God is present for it, that he's in it with you. You've just got to look for it. Look for the little yellow fish. Find it, no matter how hard your spot is. Find that little yellow fish and study it and be right here, right now, because in that is a love letter to you from a creator and a father who has a plan that is bigger than the moment you're in. It's love for you right where you are. Would you pray with me? Father, to every hard thing, to every hard journey represented in this room, Lord God, would you bring us little yellow fish? Would you bring us, Lord God, things to focus on that are you, your glory in our midst? We don't want to miss it. We don't want to miss it, not as a church, not as people. God, let us be people who are loyal to you, who will follow you into the desert places where we bring the fragrant aroma of Christ. Let us be willing to go where it's hard and trust that you will meet us there. In Jesus' name, amen.